Welcome back. Tonight's story begins with a locked drawer, not a safe, not a vault, just a small wooden drawer, tucked inside a dead man's desk in a quiet English village where nothing dangerous was ever supposed to happen. The police searched the entire house. They found no weapon. They found no motive they could prove. And they found no key. But one woman noticed the drawer, a small white-haired lady sitting quietly in the corner, knitting needles in hand, eyes that missed nothing. Her name was Miss Marple, and she had a feeling, the kind of feeling that had never quite been wrong, that whatever was locked inside that drawer was exactly what someone had killed to keep hidden. This is the drawer no one could open. Stay with me. It gets darker before it gets clear. The village wakes to something wrong. The morning of October the 14th, 1952, arrived in Chippingcroft the way most mornings did. Quietly, with a thin mist sitting low over the green and the smell of wood smoke drifting from the older cottages along Fenwick Lane. The baker's boy was already on his bicycle. Mrs. Hartley at number 7 had her curtains open. The post had not yet arrived. It was, by every measure, an ordinary morning, until Mrs. Pugh began to scream. She was not a woman given to screaming. In 22 years of service to Mr. Edmund Alderton, 22 years of polished silver, ironed newspapers, and soup served at exactly the right temperature, Mrs. Pugh had never once raised her voice above what she privately considered the acceptable register for indoor speech. She had opinions, certainly. She expressed them, but screaming was not something she did. She did it that morning. The sound came from Alderton House at approximately 7:30, and it traveled with surprising efficiency through the still October air, reaching 4 separate households before anyone thought to telephone the police. By the time Constable Reeves arrived on his bicycle, slightly breathless, his cap not quite straight, a small cluster of neighbors had already gathered at the front gate, speaking to one another in the lowered, serious voices that English villages reserve for deaths, scandals, and the occasional escaped farm animal. Edmund Alderton, aged 71, had been found dead in his study. He was slumped in his leather chair behind his large mahogany desk in the room he had occupied every evening for the better part of 3 decades. So the window was closed. The door had been unlocked. There was a glass of port on the side table, barely touched, and a book lying open on the floor beside his right hand, as though it had simply slipped from his fingers. It might have looked peaceful, almost, if not for the expression on his face, and if not for the bruising at his throat. Inspector Gerald Howe arrived from Markstone just before 9 o'clock. He was a tall man, not unpleasant-looking, with the kind of straight-backed posture that came either from military service or a very strict mother. In Howe's case, it had been both. He was 43, efficient, and carried with him a steady, low-level impatience that he had learned over the years to keep mostly out of his voice. He did not particularly enjoy village cases. They had a way of becoming complicated by gossip, by old grudges, and by a particular sort of local interference that he had never quite learned how to shut down politely. He walked through Alderton House with Constable Reeves at his heels and a notebook in his hand, asking questions in a tone that discouraged lengthy answers. The house itself was handsome, in a faded sort of way. High ceilings, good furniture, portraits on the walls that suggested the family had once thought quite well of itself. The hallway smelled of beeswax and something older. That particular mustiness of a house that had not been fully aired in some time. The study was at the end of the ground floor corridor, past the dining room and a small sitting room that looked as though it was rarely used. The door was open when Howe arrived. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, so the body had not been moved. The doctor had come and gone and confirmed what was already apparent. Edmund Alderton had been strangled, not with bare hands, but with something thin and firm. A cord, possibly. A wire. The exact instrument had not yet been determined, because the exact instrument had not been found. Howe stood at the desk and looked at the room carefully. Bookshelves on 2 walls. Floor to ceiling. A fireplace, recently used, ash still in the grate. A writing desk, its surface clear except for a blotter, a pen stand, and an empty glass. And on the left-hand side of the desk, set into the wood at knee height, a drawer. Small, unremarkable to look at. Fitted with a keyhole, the brass of it slightly tarnished. Howe tried it. Locked. He tried it again, as people always do with locked things, as though a second attempt might produce a different result. It did not. "Key," he said to Reeves. "We haven't found one, sir. Mrs. Pugh says she never had one. Says Mr. Alderton kept that drawer locked as long as she'd worked here and she'd never seen inside it." "Never?" "Never, sir. She says he was quite particular about it." Howe looked at the drawer for another moment, then straightened up and moved on. There were more pressing things first. The drawer would keep. Miss Jane Marple had arrived in the village of Chipping Croft 3 days earlier in a taxi that was 12 minutes late and smelled faintly of diesel, to visit her niece Clara, who had recently moved to a cottage on the far edge of Fenwick Lane. The journey from St. Mary Mead had been longer than she had anticipated. There had been some confusion at the second junction, which she had politely not mentioned to the driver. And by the time she arrived, she was, if she was honest with herself, rather more tired than she usually allowed herself to be. She had sat in Clara's small sitting room with a cup of tea that was slightly too weak and felt, for a moment, every one of her years. But that had passed. It usually did. By the morning of the 14th, she was quite herself again, or near enough. She had slept well, eaten a proper breakfast, and was sitting in Clara's front garden with her knitting when the sound of Mrs. Pugh's screaming reached her from the far end of the lane. She set her knitting down in her lap and listened. The quality of the sound told her something immediately. It was not a scream of pain. It was not the sharp, sudden kind that comes from a fall or a fright. It was the kind of scream that has discovery in it. Slow, escalating, almost unwilling, as though the person screaming was hoping, even as they screamed, that they had somehow made a mistake. They very rarely had. Clara appeared at the cottage door, still holding her dish towel. Good heavens! What on earth? "Something at the house up the lane, I think," Miss Marple said quite calmly. She picked her knitting back up. "You might put the kettle on again, dear. I have a feeling there will be a good deal of coming and going this morning, and people always want tea." Clara went in. Miss Marple continued knitting. She had dropped a stitch somewhere in the last row. She noticed it now, too late to fix without unraveling more than she cared to. She sighed quietly. She had been doing that more lately. Little lapses, not serious ones. Just the sort of small inattentions that crept in when one was tired, or when one's mind was perhaps working on something else without quite announcing itself. She would fix it later. By mid-morning, Fenwick Lane knew everything and nothing simultaneously, which was the usual condition of village knowledge in the early hours of a crisis. It was definitely a murder, or possibly a heart attack. The nephew had been telephoned. Mrs. Pugh had been given brandy by the vicar's wife. Inspector Howe from Markstone was inside the house and not saying anything to anyone, which everyone agreed was very unhelpful given the circumstances. Miss Marple learned most of this from old Mr. Fenn, who lived in the cottage directly opposite Clara's and who had the excellent habit, common to people of a certain age who live alone, and of noticing a great deal and being willing to discuss it at length. "Alderton," he said, leaning on his garden gate with the comfortable air of a man who has been waiting for something interesting to happen for quite some time. Kept to himself, mostly. Wealthy, or used to be. There's a nephew, young Douglas, comes by now and then, and his wife. Can't say I ever warmed to either of them, but then that's not really the point, is it? No, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. It rarely is. Did Mr. Alderton have many visitors, would you say? Mr. Fenn considered. Not many. There was a young man, Thomas, somebody. Came a few months back. Distant relative, I think. Stayed a few weeks. Quiet sort. He paused. There was some talk, you know. About the will. There usually is with money. There usually is, Miss Marple said. She asked one or two more questions, gentle, conversational, the kind that people answer without quite registering that they have been asked, and then thanked Mr. Fenn and went back inside. Clara was in the kitchen, assembling sandwiches with the slightly over-focused energy of someone who needed to do something practical. Apparently, it's that Mr. Alderton up at the end, Clara said, not turning around. Do you know, I only spoke to him twice. Once at the post office and once when his cat got into my garden. He seemed perfectly nice. A bit formal, perhaps. She paused. Do you think we should offer something? To the housekeeper, maybe. People always seem to need food. That's a very kind instinct, Miss Marple said. She sat down at the kitchen table. Clara, dear, did you ever hear anything about Mr. Alderton's study? Anything particular about it? Clara turned around. His study? No, why? No reason, Miss Marple said. Just something I heard mentioned. That wasn't quite true. Nobody had mentioned the study yet. It was simply that when Mr. Fenn had said the word will, and when she had thought about a wealthy, private man found dead in his own home, her mind had gone, quietly and almost automatically, to the place where such a man would keep the things he most wanted kept, a locked room or a locked drawer. One of those, she thought, would matter. She just didn't know which yet. The family under the roof. Douglas Alderton arrived at 11:30 in a motor car that was slightly too large and slightly too clean for a man who had just received news of his uncle's murder. He was 38, broad-shouldered, with dark hair combed back with some precision and a face that had the particular quality of being difficult to read. Not because it was blank exactly, but because whatever it expressed always seemed to be one thing while suggesting, faintly, something else entirely. He wore a dark coat. That was appropriate. He wore it well. That was, Miss Marple would later think, perhaps slightly too appropriate. His wife Cecily came with him, as wives in such situations always do, sitting in the passenger seat with her gloved hands folded in her lap and an expression of careful distress arranged on her face. She was younger than Douglas by perhaps 6 or 7 years, fair-haired, with large eyes and the kind of soft, appealing manner that tends to make people underestimate the intelligence behind it. Whether there was intelligence behind it, Miss Marple had not yet determined. She watched them arrive from Clara's front garden over the top of her knitting with a particular quality of attention that she had long ago learned to make look like inattention. It was a useful skill. People behaved quite differently when they believed themselves unobserved. Douglas got out of the car first. He stood for a moment, looking up at Alderton House with an expression that Miss Marple could not quite read from that distance. Then he straightened his coat, said something brief to Cecily, and went inside without waiting for her. Cecily followed, in a little more slowly. Inside Alderton House, Inspector Howe had been working through the morning with the systematic thoroughness that was his chief professional virtue. He had spoken to Mrs. Pugh at length. He had examined every room on the ground floor. He had sent Constable Reeves to make inquiries in the village and had himself made several telephone calls from the hallway. The study had been gone over carefully. The fireplace ash had been collected. The port glass had been taken away. The books on the shelves had been noted, if not read. The drawer remained locked. Howe had made 3 attempts to open it through conventional means, and one attempt, of which he was not particularly proud, involving a letter opener that had achieved nothing except a small scratch on the brass fitting. And a locksmith from Markston had been telephoned and was expected sometime that afternoon. When Douglas Alderton walked through the front door, Howe met him in the hallway with the measured, careful courtesy he reserved for bereaved relatives who were also, in all statistical likelihood, persons of interest. Mr. Alderton, I'm very sorry for your loss. Douglas shook his hand with a firm, brief grip. Thank you. I came as soon as I could. He looked past Howe, toward the corridor. Is he still? No. The body has been removed. The study is still sealed off, I'm afraid. Something moved across Douglas's face. too quickly to name. Of course. Naturally. He turned, as though remembering her, towards Cecily, who had appeared at his shoulder. My wife, Cecily. Mrs. Alderton? Howe nodded. I'll need to speak with you both. When you're ready. Whenever you like, Cecily said. Her voice was soft, with a slight catch in it that might have been genuine grief or might have been very good manners. Whatever helps. Mrs. Pugh had recovered herself by midday. Or rather, she had converted her distress into the more manageable form of activity and was now moving through the kitchen with a compressed, furious energy, making tea that nobody had asked for and refusing all offers of assistance with a firmness that made it clear assistance was not the point. She was 61, stout, with iron-grey hair pinned back so severely it seemed to be holding her face in place. She had worked for Edmund Alderton since she was 39, and she had, over those 22 years, developed the particular loyalty of a person who has organized someone else's life for so long that the two become, in some inextricable way, bound together. His death was, for her, not merely a loss, it was a kind of displacement, as though the ground she had been standing on had simply ceased to exist. She did not cry again. She made tea. She also, when Douglas and Cecily arrived, watched them with an expression that she did not bother to conceal, a hard, assessing look that she directed particularly at Douglas, and which he appeared either not to notice or to have decided to ignore. Miss Marple noticed it. She noticed it because she had, by that afternoon, found a perfectly reasonable excuse to be inside the house herself. Clara's casserole dish had done it. Clara had prepared a dish, chicken with vegetables, and a great deal more effort than was strictly necessary for a gesture of neighborly condolence, and had asked Miss Marple to carry it up, since her own back was troubling her that afternoon. Miss Marple had agreed with the kind of ready willingness that had nothing to do with casseroles. Mrs. Pugh had taken the dish at the door with the automatic gratitude of someone going through the correct motions, and had then, because Miss Marple had asked after her in exactly the right tone of voice, genuinely, without fuss, woman to woman, held the door open a little wider. You might as well come in for a moment, Mrs. Pugh said, though I warn you it's not a comfortable house to be in today. I expect not, Miss Marple said, and stepped inside. She was given tea in the kitchen, which suited her better than the sitting room would have done. The kitchen was where Mrs. Pugh was comfortable, and comfortable people said more than they intended to. The casserole dish was set on the counter. The tea was poured, and Mrs. Pugh, who had been holding herself together with considerable effort since 7:30 that morning, sat down across from a small white-haired lady she had never met before and found, to her own apparent surprise, that she was talking. He was a private man, she said. People in the village thought him cold, maybe. He wasn't cold. He was private. There's a difference. There is, Miss Marple agreed. He'd had difficulties. Financial ones a few years back. He'd sorted it. He was very capable, Mr. Alderton. But it had cost him. He wasn't the man he used to be these last 2 years. Quieter. More worried, I thought, though he'd never say so. Worried about what sort of thing? Mrs. Pugh was quiet for a moment. She turned her teacup slightly on its saucer. Once, twice. The will, she said finally. That's what I think, though I don't know the details. He'd had his solicitor here twice in the last 6 months, which wasn't usual. And after the second visit, after Mr. Grantham left, Mr. Alderton sat in that study for the rest of the day and didn't come out for dinner. Just sat in there. She paused. That was about 3 weeks ago. Did he seem different after that? He seemed decided, Mrs. Pugh said, like a man who'd made up his mind about something difficult. She looked at her teacup. I should have asked him. I didn't. There was a silence between them. The comfortable, sad kind. Then Miss Marple said quite gently, Mrs. Pugh, the drawer in the study, the locked one. Had it always been locked? Mrs. Pugh looked up. Always. From the day I started. I dusted around it for 22 years and never once saw it open. Did you ever ask him about it? Once. Early on. He said it was personal business and smiled in a way that meant the subject was finished. She paused. I never asked again. Did anyone else ever show an interest in it? Any of the family? Mrs. Pugh's expression shifted. Barely, but enough. Mr. Douglas asked about it. About 8 months ago it was. Came to visit and spent quite a long time in the study with his uncle. I wasn't in the room. I don't listen at doors. She said this with the dignity of a woman who occasionally listened at doors. But when Douglas came out, he looked not happy. And that evening, Mr. Alderton was very quiet indeed. Miss Marple absorbed this carefully. And the young man, Thomas, I believe, the distant relative. Something in Mrs. Pugh's face changed, became more careful. Mr. Thomas Alcott. Yes, he was here in the summer. 6 weeks, roughly. What did you make of him? I don't know what to make of him, Mrs. Pugh said, which was, Miss Marple thought, quite a different answer from nothing in particular. She did not stay long after that. She thanked Mrs. Pugh, declined a second cup of tea, and was shown back through the hallway toward the front door. It was in the hallway that she saw Cecily Alderton. Cecily was coming down the stairs, slowly, one hand trailing the banister. And she was wearing a different blouse from the one she had arrived in, which meant she had brought luggage, and which meant she and Douglas had planned to stay. She had removed her gloves. Her left wrist, bare now, showed a bracelet, gold with a small charm on it, a little key, a decorative key, the kind jewelers made as charms. Probably meaningless. Probably. Cecily saw Miss Marple and smiled. Warm, quick, a little uncertain. Oh, hello. Have you come to... Just dropping something for Mrs. Pugh, Miss Marple said pleasantly. From my niece, down the lane. A casserole. Very ordinary, I'm afraid. That's so kind. Cecily came the rest of the way down the stairs. Are you staying nearby? With my niece, yes. Clara Hayward. Oh. Something flickered. I think Edmund mentioned a Miss Hayward once. Very possibly. Small village. Miss Marple smiled. I hope you and your husband will be all right, my dear. It's a very difficult thing. Cecily's smile held, but something behind it shifted. Some slight adjustment, like a door that has been carefully, quietly pulled closed. Yes, she said. It is. Miss Marple noticed 3 things before she left Alderton House that afternoon. The first was the rug in the study hallway, visible from the doorway, since the study door was standing open when she passed it. It was a good Turkish rug, dark red with a geometric border, and it had been moved. Not replaced. Moved. Slightly, perhaps 6 inches from its usual position, judging by the faint rectangular impression left on the floorboards beside it. Recently moved and not moved back. The second was a candle on the windowsill of the small sitting room, a tall white dinner candle in a brass holder, burned nearly to the base, as that windowsill received very little natural light. There was no good reason to put a candle there during the day. There was one reason to put it there at night, to see, or to be seen. The third was Cecily's bracelet. Specifically, the fact that when Cecily had reached out to touch the banister on the last step, the charm had caught the light, and Miss Marple had seen it clearly. A small key, cast in gold, with a decorative scroll at the top. Old-fashioned design, quite specific in its shape. She thought about it all the way down Fenwick Lane, walking slowly in the thin afternoon light, her bag over her arm, turning the observations over in her mind the way she turned difficult stitches. Carefully, without forcing. Young Thomas Alcott. 6 weeks in the summer. Mrs. Pugh, who didn't know what to make of him. Douglas, who had asked about the drawer 8 months ago and come out of the study unhappy. A will being reconsidered. A solicitor visiting twice, a locked drawer that no one had ever seen open. She stopped at Clara's gate and stood there for a moment, looking back up the lane toward Alderton House, which sat at the end of it like a full stop at the end of a sentence she hadn't quite finished reading. Then she went inside. "How was it?" Clara asked from the kitchen. "Very informative," Miss Marple said. "For a condolence call?" Clara appeared in the doorway. "You didn't go to be condoling, did you?" "I brought a casserole," Miss Marple said with perfect innocence, and went upstairs to find her second pair of reading glasses, which she had, characteristically, left in the wrong room. What the drawer remembers. The following morning was grey, with the particular flat, colourless quality that October mornings in the English countryside reserve for days when something important is going to happen. The mist had not lifted properly. The trees along Fenwick Lane stood in it like figures waiting for something, their lower branches disappearing into whiteness. Miss Marple was up at 6:30. She had not slept badly exactly. She had slept in the way she sometimes did when her mind had taken hold of something in the night and was working on it quietly, below the level of dreaming. A restless, productive kind of sleep that left her rested enough, but with the distinct sense that her thoughts had been somewhere busy while she was away from them. She dressed, came downstairs, and made her own tea because Clara was still sleeping and because, frankly, she preferred to make it herself. She sat at the kitchen table with the cup in front of her and her knitting to one side. She had decided the previous evening to simply unravel the last 3 rows and start them again, which was always the honest solution, however tedious. And she thought. She thought about Edmund Alderton, a private man, Mrs. Pugh had said, decided after the solicitor's second visit. A man who had sat alone in his study for an entire evening after making up his mind about something difficult. She thought about Douglas, the too clean car, the coat worn slightly too well, the look that passed over his face when Howe mentioned the study. She thought about Cecily's bracelet, and then she thought about Thomas Alcott, who had been here for 6 weeks in the summer, who was quiet and watchful, and about whom Mrs. Pugh had said, with considerable precision, that she did not know what to make of him. There were several possible shapes to this, she thought. Several ways the pieces might fit. But there was one shape that kept reasserting itself, one arrangement that made everything sit tidily. The solicitor's visits, the changed will, the locked drawer, the unhappy nephew. And it was the kind of shape that, in her experience, tended to be right precisely because it was the arrangement that nobody wanted to look at directly. She put down her tea. She would need to go out this morning. She went first to the post office, which in Chippingcroft occupied the front room of a terraced cottage on the High Street and was run by a woman named Mrs. Doris Beale, who had been running it for 19 years and who knew, with the comprehensive, unself-conscious knowledge of all village postmistresses, rather more about the private lives of Chippingcroft's residents than any of them would have found comfortable to consider. Miss Marple bought a book of stamps she did not need, admired the display of postcards near the door, and mentioned in a tone of gentle, neighborly curiosity that she had heard something about a Mr. Alderton. Mrs. Beale needed no further encouragement. "Dreadful business," she said, with the solemn relish of a woman delivering important news. "We're all quite shocked, though, and I say this carefully, Mr. Alderton did have his complications." "Oh?" The nephew. Mrs. Beale leaned slightly across the counter. "Mr. Douglas Alderton, there was talk last spring about some money. A loan, people said, though loan is perhaps a generous word for it. Mr. Alderton had apparently given Douglas quite a substantial sum 2 or 3 years ago to help with some business venture or other. And the venture," she paused for effect, "did not venture. The money was lost. The money was gone," Mrs. Beale said, in a tone that drew a careful distinction between the two. And Mr. Alderton, from what people said, was not entirely at peace with that. There was some question, nothing confirmed, mind you, about whether Douglas had been entirely straightforward about what the money was for. Miss Marple absorbed this. And was there anyone else Mr. Alderton was close to? A Thomas Alcott, perhaps? Mrs. Beale's expression shifted, became thoughtful, slightly more guarded. "Oh yes, young Mr. Alcott. He was here in July and August. Very quiet young man, very polite." She paused. People wondered about him, where he'd come from exactly. Mr. Alderton introduced him as a cousin's son, but nobody quite knew which cousin. Another pause. He spent a great deal of time with Mr. Alderton, long evenings together, walks, it was. It struck some people as rather intense for a distant relative. "Did it?" Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And then he left, quite suddenly at the end of August. And after he left, Mr. Alderton had that solicitor of his down from London twice in 6 weeks." Mrs. Beale looked at Miss Marple with the clear eyes of a woman who had assembled this particular sequence of events before and found it suggestive. "Make of that what you will." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I think I shall." She walked from the post office to St. Andrew's Church, which stood at the upper end of the high street behind a low stone wall and a row of yew trees so old that they had taken on the slightly menacing quality of things that have watched too much. The church itself was Norman mostly, with Victorian additions that the Norman parts appeared to tolerate without enthusiasm. The vicar, a gentle, distracted man named Reverend Hollis, was in the churchyard when Miss Marple arrived, engaged in a losing battle with a rose bush that had grown considerably beyond its station. They talked for 20 minutes. Reverend Hollis, as it turned out, had known Edmund Alderton for 11 years, had visited him regularly, and had found him in recent months to be a man with something on his mind. "He asked me once," Reverend Hollis said, pausing with his gardening gloves still on, "whether a man had an obligation to correct a wrong that had been committed before his time. Not by him, just inherited, you might say. I gave him what I thought was a useful answer. He looked mildly regretful. I'm not certain it was." "What was your answer?" "That the obligation exists, but the timing of it is a matter of conscience." He looked at the rose bush. He seemed to think that was helpful. He also seemed to think it was going to be rather costly. Miss Marple thought about inheritance fraud and locked drawers and a man who had sat alone in his study after deciding something difficult. "Did he say anything more specific?" "Not to me." Reverend Hollis frowned thoughtfully, though he did mention, the last time I saw him, about a fortnight ago, that he had decided to put certain things in order. He seemed relieved, actually, the way people sometimes seem when they have finally done the thing they were afraid to do. He paused. "That was the last proper conversation I had with him. 4 days later, he was dead. She was on her way back down the high street when she made her mistake. It was a small one. Not serious. The kind of thing that happens when one is thinking about several things at once and not attending properly to practical geography. She had meant to call at the gardener's cottage. Old Walt Hobbs, who had kept Alderton House's grounds for 30 years, and who lived, she had been told, in the second cottage past the bakery on Mill Road. She turned at the bakery, found the second cottage, opened the gate, and walked halfway up the path before the woman who appeared in the doorway made it apparent that this was not, in any sense, the right house. "Can I help you?" said the woman, young, puzzled, holding a baby on her hip. Miss Marple stopped. She looked at the cottage, then at the gate, then back at the woman. "I'm so sorry," she said with perfect composure, though she felt the flush of embarrassment that she had never quite managed to find undignified. "I was looking for Mr. Hobbs. I appear to have the wrong cottage entirely." "Walt Hobbs? He's the next one along. The one with the green gate." "Of course it is. Green gate. Yes." Miss Marple thanked her, turned around, walked back out, and found the green gate without further incident. She allowed herself, very briefly, to feel foolish. And then she let it go. One wrong gate. It happened. It was happening somewhat more often lately, if she was honest, but there was no profit in dwelling on it, and a great deal of lost time in doing so. Walt Hobbs was 81, not much taller than Miss Marple herself, with hands like gnarled root vegetables and the long, slow, Observational patience of a man who had spent decades working with things that grew at their own pace, regardless of anyone's preferences. He gave her a seat on an upturned crate in his front garden, the only seating available, and answered her questions without any of the verbal elaboration she had encountered elsewhere. He spoke in short, factual sentences, which she found refreshing. "Mr. Alderton, good employer, fair man. Did you notice anything unusual recently, in the last few weeks?" Light in the study. Late. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. She had brought it instinctively, the way other people brought handbags. "How late?" "Past midnight, 3, 4 times. Last week and the week before." Walt Hobbs pulled a stem of something from the soil beside him and examined it with attention. "Not usual. He'd go to bed by 10 normally, regular as anything." "Did you see anyone else at the house during those late nights?" A pause, long enough to be deliberate. "Once," he said. "Thursday before last. Car on the lane, parked up by the oak. Not running, just sitting." "What kind of car?" "Dark. Big enough. Couldn't tell the make in the dark." He paused. "But it was there at 11 and gone by 1. "Thursday before last," Miss Marple repeated, doing the calculation. "That would be 3 days before he died." Walt Hobbs nodded once. He did not seem surprised by this conclusion or particularly disturbed by it. He was the kind of man who had watched things grow and die for long enough that the fact of death had lost most of its capacity to shock him. The manner of it was another question. "One more thing," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Herm Alcott, the young man who stayed in the summer. Did you have much to do with him?" For the first time, something shifted in Walt Hobbs's expression. "Not much, but enough. Came out to the garden sometimes, in the evenings. Asked about the house." A pause. "Asked about the family. Older family, past generations. Seemed very interested in the history of the place." "The history of the Alderton family specifically?" "Specifically," Walt Hobbs confirmed. She found the photograph that afternoon. She had not been looking for a photograph. She had been looking, with Mrs. Pugh's permission and Inspector Howe's absence. He had gone back to Markston for the afternoon and left Constable Reeves, who was 22 and easily engaged in conversation, for anything that might tell her more about the period immediately before Edmund Alderton's death. Mrs. Pugh had shown her the study from the doorway. She had not gone in. The room was still formally sealed, a fact that Constable Reeves had explained with some pride. But the doorway was enough to let her look carefully. The desk, the drawer, the bookshelves, and on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, among the small collection of objects that people accumulate over long lives. A carriage clock, a china dish, 2 small framed photographs. One picture that caught her eye. It was the larger of the 2 frames. A family photograph. Clearly old. The quality of it, the clothing of the subjects, suggested the early 30s. 3 people, an older man, a younger man, and a woman in between them. The older man bore a resemblance to the portraits she had seen in the hallway. An Alderton, certainly. The younger man was perhaps 20, standing slightly apart from the other 2, with a particular set to his shoulders. She could not see the photograph clearly enough from the doorway. She asked Constable Reeves if she might step inside for just a moment, framed it as a concern about the china dish, which she claimed to recognize as a piece her friend Mrs. Something had once owned, and Constable Reeves, to his future professional regret, let her. She crossed to the mantelpiece, glanced at the china dish, and looked at the photograph properly. The young man was not an Alderton. She was nearly certain of it. The resemblance to the older man was absent in every feature that heredity reliably transmits. The jaw, the brow, the set of the eyes. He was not a son or nephew of that older man. He was simply standing with them. But someone had written on the back of the frame. She could see the edge of an inscription through the glass. E.R. and the boy. Stanton, 1931. The boy, not his boy, Not young Edmund or young Robert, just the boy. She stood there for a moment, quite still, looking at it. Then she went back to the doorway, thanked Constable Reeves, and returned to the hall. Her mind was moving quickly now, the particular quick, connecting movement that she had learned over many years to trust rather than question. The photograph. Thomas Alcott's questions about the family history, the solicitor's visits, the changed will, and a wrong committed before his time, not by him, just inherited. She thought about what it would mean. What it would mean to be a man like Edmund Alderton, private and careful, and finally, late in life, decided. And to discover that something in your family's past had created an obligation, a real one, the kind that could be satisfied by a will, the kind that certain other people would very much prefer not to be satisfied. She was tired by the time she left the house, more than she expected. The morning's walking and the afternoon's concentration had used more than they should have, and she felt it as she came down the front path and back onto Fenwick Lane, a heaviness in her legs, a slight blurring at the edges of her thoughts. She stopped halfway down the lane and stood for a moment, simply breathing, so there was something she had been thinking in the study, something that had risen up clearly and then slipped sideways before she could pin it down. Something about the drawer. Not the contents, but the lock itself. The way the keyhole sat. The angle of it, the brass worn in a particular pattern. It was gone now. She couldn't retrieve it. She stood there in the lane, faintly irritated with herself, while the October afternoon settled around her and a blackbird in the yew hedge made its short, concerned sound. Then she straightened up, shifted her bag on her arm, and walked on. It would come back. These things always came back if you left them alone long enough. The trick was not to chase them, but to let them come to you in their own time, the way difficult stitches sometimes resolved themselves if you simply looked away for a while. Now she went home. She ate Clara's soup. She sat by the fire and knitted badly. She was still not reconciled with those 3 unraveled rows. And she thought quietly about inheritance and photographs, and what a man decides to do when he finally decides to do the right thing, and about what someone else decides to do to stop him. She was nearly asleep in her chair when it came back. The keyhole, the brass worn in a particular pattern. Worn on the left side, not the right, which meant the key had always been inserted from the left at a slight angle, which was unusual because most people are right-handed and insert keys from the right. It was a small thing, almost nothing. But it meant the key was designed for a left-handed person, or designed to be used in a specific, deliberate way, turned at an angle, or with a specific knowledge of how this particular lock worked. She sat up in her chair, Cecily Alderton on the stairs, left hand trailing the banister, the bracelet on the left wrist. She thought about that. Then she thought about the charm on the bracelet, the small decorative key, gold, with a scroll at the top. Decorative, almost certainly decorative. But what if it wasn't? The key that was never lost. She did not sleep well after that. Not badly either. It was not the restless, uncomfortable wakefulness of illness or worry. It was the other kind. The kind where the mind has found the edge of something real and will not quite release it, turning it over and over in the dark with the quiet insistence of a cat with something small and live. She lay in Clara's spare bedroom, looking at the ceiling, and thought about keys. The practical question first. A decorative key on a charm bracelet. Could it function as an actual key? In most cases, no. Charm keys were cast solid, or nearly so, without the precision cuts that a working lock required. They were symbols, gestures toward the idea of a key. But there were exceptions. She had seen one once, many years ago, a bracelet belonging to a woman in Saint. a Mary Mead whose late husband had been a jeweler of unusual sentiment. He had made her a charm bracelet in which one charm, a small key, was in fact a working duplicate of the key to the box where he kept her love letters. A private joke, a private secret, the kind of thing that a man of particular feeling and particular craft might do. It was not common, but it was not impossible. And the question was not whether Cecily's charm was functional. The question was who had given it to her, and when, and why. She turned onto her side. Douglas Alderton had asked about the drawer 8 months ago and come out of the study unhappy. That suggested he did not have access to it, or at least did not then. But Cecily's bracelet was not new. She had noticed when Cecily extended her hand on the staircase, the slight darkening of the gold that comes with years of wear. That bracelet had been on that wrist for some time. So, if the charm was a key, if it was a working key to that specific drawer, then someone had given it to Cecily. Not recently, not in the last 8 months, but before Douglas had tried and failed to learn what was in the drawer. Before Douglas had even known the drawer mattered, which meant whoever gave Cecily that key had known about the drawer long before Douglas did, and had chosen, very deliberately, not to tell him. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she thought. In the morning it would be clearer. It was not particularly clearer in the morning, but it was more organized, which was almost the same thing, as she came downstairs to find a note from Clara on the kitchen table. Gone to the butcher's and the post office. Back by 10, there is bread and the good marmalade. And a kitchen to herself, which suited her very well. She made tea. She made toast. She ate standing at the counter, looking out of the small kitchen window at the garden, which was past its best now, but still had some color in it. Late asters, the last of the dahlias, a rose that had no business still flowering in October, but was doing so anyway with a kind of cheerful obstinacy that she found companionable. She thought about what she had and what she still needed. She had a dead man, a locked drawer, a missing weapon, a nephew with financial motive and a history of dishonesty, a bracelet charm that might or might not be a functioning key, and a photograph of a young man who was not an Alderton, a solicitor who had visited twice in 6 weeks, a car parked in the lane 3 nights before the murder, and a late light in the study burning past midnight on multiple occasions. She needed confirmation of the will's contents, or at least its recent alterations, evidence of who was in the house on the night of the murder, and she needed to understand Thomas Alcott. His presence that summer had set something in motion. She was becoming increasingly certain of it. She finished her toast and went to find Inspector Howe. He was not pleased to see her. He was professionally courteous about it. He had been professionally courteous throughout, which she appreciated even while she understood that the courtesy was functioning as a form of polite dismissal. For he was the sort of man who held doors open for women while simultaneously ensuring they had no access to the rooms beyond. She found him at the small incident room he had established in the back office of the Chipping Croft Village Hall. A borrowed table, 2 borrowed chairs, Constable Reeves and a younger officer from Markston, and a board on the wall with names and times written on it in Howe's careful, upright hand. "Miss Marple," he said, rising slightly from his chair and settling back again in one fluid, barely interrupted movement. "What can I do for you?" She sat down in the chair across from him without waiting to be invited. He noticed this and chose not to address it. "I have some observations I thought might be useful," she said. "I see." He put down his pen with the specific care of a man exercising patience. "Go on," and then she told him about the keyhole, the left side wear on the brass, the left-handed manner of use that it implied. She told him about Cecily's bracelet, the charm, the age of it, the positioning on the left wrist. She told him, carefully, about the photograph on the mantelpiece and the inscription, E.R. and the boy, and what she thought it might mean in light of Thomas Alcott's questions about the family history. She did not tell him everything. She kept back two things. The thought that had come to her, half asleep in the chair, about who had given Cecily the key and when, and the shape that was assembling itself in her mind about the whole arrangement. She kept those back because they were not yet solid enough, and because Howe was the kind of man who required solid things. Half-formed theories would not help her here, so they would only give him reason to stop listening. He listened to what she did tell him with the expression of a man engaged in the internal struggle between dismissal and the faint, uncomfortable suspicion that he was hearing something relevant. When she had finished, there was a pause. "The bracelet," he said. "You think the charm is a working key. I think it may be worth examining." "On what basis?" "On the basis that it is the right shape, approximately the right size, and is being worn by a woman whose husband has a clear financial interest in the contents of that drawer." She paused. "And on the basis that the locksmith from Markston has still not managed to open it by conventional means, which suggests the lock is less standard than it appears." Howe looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his notes, and then he looked at the wall. "I'll look into it," he said, in a tone that meant I will consider looking into it after I have exhausted every avenue that does not involve taking advice from a retired village lady. Miss Marple thanked him pleasantly and left. She was not discouraged. She had not expected immediate action. She had expected and received the thing that actually mattered, which was the look on his face in the moment just before he said, "I'll look into it." The look of a man who has just understood something and is not quite ready to admit it. That look meant he would act. Not immediately, but he would act. She spent the middle part of the day doing something that looked, to anyone who might have observed her, entirely unrelated to murder. She went to the county library in Markston. Sir Clara drove her, uncertain about the purpose, but long accustomed to her aunt's oblique methods, and left her there for 2 hours while she did her own errands. Miss Marple found the section she needed without difficulty. County records, land registries, historical genealogies of the older local families. She was looking for the Aldertons. What she found over the course of 90 minutes and 4 separate volumes confirmed the shape that had been assembling in her mind since the previous evening, confirmed it not completely, not in legal terms, but in the way that matters most in the early stages of understanding a crime. It made everything cohere. Every piece that had been slightly off-center shifted, slightly into alignment. The Alderton family had been in Chippingcroft since the 1880s. The family money, substantial, as at its height, had been built by Edmund's father, Robert Alderton, in the 20s and 30s, through a combination of land acquisition and what the records described as property consolidation, which was the period's polite term for buying land cheaply from people who needed money and had no good alternatives. Among the acquisitions in 1931, and here Miss Marple stopped and sat very still for a moment, was a farm and cottage property on the eastern edge of the Chippingcroft land, purchased from a family named Alcott, for considerably less than its probable value. E.R. and the boy, Stanton, 1931. She sat back in her chair. Stanton was a hamlet 4 miles east of Chippingcroft. She knew it or knew of it. It had very little left to it now. A few houses, the remains of a farm. The Alcott family had owned land in Stanton and had sold it or been compelled to sell it to Robert Alderton in 1931. And Robert Alderton had paid them considerably less than it was worth. Edmund Alderton had asked a vicar whether a man had an obligation to correct a wrong committed before his time, not by him, just inherited. And Thomas Alcott, quiet, watchful, interested in the family history, had spent 6 weeks at Alderton House in the summer. She understood now what those 6 weeks had been. Thomas had not come to the house as a distant relative making a casual visit. He had come, she thought, to tell Edmund Alderton something, or to give him the evidence to understand something that Edmund had perhaps already half suspected. The wrong that needed correcting was not recent. It was 30 years old. It was in the family's foundations. in the money that had funded the house, the portraits, the good furniture, the careful private life. And Edmund, in his last weeks, had decided to do something about it, to change his will, to leave some portion of it at least to Thomas Alcott, the descendant of the family his father had wronged. And Douglas, who stood to inherit everything, had discovered this, or feared it, or had been watching for signs of it since the day he asked about the drawer and came out of the study unhappy. Clara collected her at 4 o'clock. Miss Marple was quiet in the car, which Clara respected without comment, having learned many years ago that her aunt's silences were not social failures, but working conditions. They were nearly back in Chipping Croft when Miss Marple said, "Clara, dear, do you know when Douglas and Cecily Alderton were married?" Clara frowned at the road. "I have no idea. Why?" "I was just thinking about bracelets," Miss Marple said, which Clara correctly understood as an answer she was not meant to interpret. The unsettling moment came at 10:20 that night. Miss Marple had gone to bed at 9. She had been genuinely tired, the library visit and the long thinking of the day having taken their toll in the honest physical way that a long walk takes its toll, and had been nearly asleep when she heard something from the lane outside. Not a loud sound, not an alarming one in isolation. A car idling, then stopping. The soft sound, perhaps, of a door. She lay still for a moment. Then she got up, put on her dressing gown, and went to the window. The lane was dark. The village had no street lamps along Fenwick Lane, and the night was overcast, with no moon visible, so she could see almost nothing. The pale line of the road, the darker shapes of the hedges, the silhouette of Alderton House at the far end, its windows unlit, almost unlit. There was a light. Not in the study. The study faced the back garden. This was a light in the first-floor window, a bedroom, moving slightly. Not the steady glow of an electric light, but something carried, a torch, perhaps. She watched it for perhaps 2 minutes. Then it went out. She stood at the window for a while longer, her hand resting on the cold glass, thinking. Then she went back to bed, but not to sleep. Someone was in Alderton House at 10:30 at night, moving through a dark bedroom with a torch. The house where a man had been murdered 4 days ago. The house that was still, technically, sealed. Inspector Howe, she thought, needed to know about this. But it was nearly 11 o'clock, and she did not have a telephone number for Inspector Howe, and by the time she found a way to reach him, whatever had been happening in that bedroom would long be finished. She made a mental note. She fixed it carefully in her mind, the way she fixed difficult pattern rows, repeating the key information 3 times, in order so that it would be there in the morning. First floor, east side, 10:20. Moving light, 2 minutes, then gone. Then she lay in the dark and thought about the drawer. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would go back to the house. She went the next morning and she found the key, not the charm bracelet. That was still on Cecily's wrist and would require Inspector Howe to address in due course. What she found was something else. The original key, now the one that had always existed, the one that everyone had assumed was lost. She found it because of the rug. She had been thinking, intermittently, about the rug since the first day. The Turkish rug in the study hallway moved 6 inches from its usual position, the rectangular impression on the floorboards beside it. Everyone had looked at the rug and seen a rug. She had looked at it and seen a rug that had been moved, and the question was why. Mrs. Pugh let her into the house at 9:30. Douglas and Cecily were at breakfast. Inspector Howe had not yet arrived. Mrs. Pugh had developed, over the past 2 days, a tacit understanding with Miss Marple that operated on the basis of neither of them mentioning it directly. She simply allowed Miss Marple access to the house, in the same way she allowed access to the kitchen, as a practical acknowledgement of someone she had decided to trust. Miss Marple went to the study hallway. The study door was closed, but not locked. Constable Reeves had left it so the previous afternoon. She looked at the rug. She moved it. Beneath it, in the gap between the floorboards, a gap that the rug had been covering, was a small, flat key. She did not touch it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she called for Mrs. Pugh. Inspector Howe arrived at 11. He looked at the key. He looked at Miss Marple. He looked at the key again. "Under the rug," he said. "Under the rug," Miss Marple confirmed, which had been moved 6 inches from its usual position. "You can see the impression on the floorboards quite clearly." She paused. "Someone moved the rug to hide the key beneath it. Quickly, in the dark, I should think. Which is why they moved it only 6 inches instead of placing it back precisely. In daylight, with time, they would have done it properly. They didn't have time." Howe looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize. The reluctant, slightly pained expression of a man receiving useful information from an unexpected source. "The night of the murder?" he said. "Yes. After it, I think. The key was hidden after Mr. Alderton was killed. Put somewhere that a quick search wouldn't find it. Under a rug, in the hallway, not in the study itself. Whoever hid it was in a hurry and was trying to ensure the drawer couldn't easily be opened." She paused. "They wanted the drawer's contents to remain unknown. Because the contents proved motive." "Because the contents proved motive," she agreed. "Or disproved a claim. Or both." Howe was quiet for a moment. Then, "The bracelet. Mrs. Douglas Alderton's bracelet. You still think—" "I think you should examine it carefully," Miss Marple said. "And I think, when you do, you will find that it is not merely decorative." She paused. "I also think you should know that there was someone in this house last night. First floor, east side, at approximately 10:20, moving through a dark room with a torch." Howe stared at her. "I saw it from my niece's window," she said simply. "I have no telephone number for you, Inspector, or I would have called." He looked for just a moment as though he wished she had one too. The drawer finally opens. The morning of the 18th dawned still and heavy. The mist clinging to Fenwick Lane like a secret it was reluctant to surrender. Miss Marple had been awake since before 6, though she had not risen immediately. Instead, she had lain in the narrow bed in Clara's spare room, watching the square of window lighten from charcoal to pearl gray, her hands folded neatly over the counterpane. She had not knitted. For once, the needles had stayed in their case. There were moments, she had learned long ago, when even the most comforting habits must give way to thought. Clara was already in the kitchen when Miss Marple came downstairs at 7:30. The smell of fresh toast and proper strong tea met her at the door. A small, steady kindness that Miss Marple accepted without comment. Now they breakfasted at the little table by the window, Clara chattering lightly about the butcher's prices and the new vicar's wife's unfortunate hat, while Miss Marple listened with half an ear and let the other half turn over the events of the previous night. The moving light in the upstairs window, the key under the rug, the bracelet on Cecily Alderton's left wrist. She had almost finished her second cup when the sound of a motor car came up the lane. Not the too clean one belonging to Douglas. This was Inspector Howe's official car, plain and purposeful, its tires crunching on the gravel outside Alderton House. Miss Marple set her cup down with a small, decisive click. "I think, dear," she said quietly, "I shall walk up to the house after breakfast. There may be developments." Clara looked at her aunt with the expression of someone who had long since stopped asking unnecessary questions. "Shall I come with you?" "Not this time, Clara. I believe Inspector Howe will prefer to conduct his business without too many extra witnesses. But you might put the kettle on again for later. I have a feeling we shall have visitors before the morning is out." She arrived at Alderton House just as Howe was stepping from his car. He looked tired, but there was a new alertness in his posture. The look of a man who had spent the small hours considering possibilities he had previously dismissed. Constable Reeves hovered behind him like an anxious shadow. "Miss Marple," Howe said, touching the brim of his hat. It was not quite a greeting, but it was not quite dismissal either. You're early." "I find early mornings clarifying," she replied mildly, "especially after a disturbed night." He gave her a sharp look, but said nothing more. Instead, he led the way inside. Mrs. Pugh met them in the hall, her face set in the same compressed lines of loyalty and grief Miss Marple had seen 3 days earlier. Douglas and Cecily were already downstairs, standing together by the drawing-room door. Douglas's tie was knotted a fraction too tightly. Cecily's hands were clasped in front of her, the gold bracelet catching the thin light from the hall window. The small key charm swung once, gently as she moved. Howe wasted no time on pleasantries. He had clearly reached the point where politeness felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. "Mrs. Alderton," he said, turning to Cecily, "I must ask you to remove your bracelet." Cecily's eyes widened, but only for a moment. "I beg your pardon." "The charm," Howe said. "The small key. I have reason to believe it may fit the lock on the study drawer." A silence fell, tight and uncomfortable. Douglas took half a step forward, then stopped. "This is ridiculous. My wife's jewelry." "Mr. Alderton," Howe cut in, his voice level but final. "We can do this here or at the station. Your choice." Cecily looked at her husband. Something passed between them, too quick for anyone else to read. And then she unclasped the bracelet with steady fingers. She handed it to Howe without a word. The inspector examined the charm under the hall light, turning it slowly. The scrollwork at the top, the precise cuts along the shaft. He glanced once at Miss Marple, who gave the smallest nod. As they moved as a small, silent procession to the study. The door was unlocked now, the room no longer sealed. The Turkish rug had been returned to its exact position. The faint rectangular mark on the floorboards had been noted and photographed. Howe knelt before the drawer, fitted the tiny gold charm into the keyhole, and turned it, left-handed at the slight angle the worn brass demanded. There was a soft, precise click. The drawer slid open. Inside lay 3 things, arranged with the neatness of a man who had known exactly what he was doing. First, a single sheet of heavy notepaper, folded once. Edmund Alderton's handwriting, clear and steady. "To whom it may concern, my last will and testament, executed this 29th day of September 1952, revokes all previous wills. And I leave the sum of £5,000 in the freehold of Stanton Farm to Thomas Alcott, in recognition of a debt long owed by my family. The remainder of my estate is to be divided equally between my nephew Douglas Alderton and such charitable causes as my solicitor shall advise. Signed, Edmund Robert Alderton, 2nd, a bundle of yellow documents tied with faded ribbon. The top sheet was the deed of sale dated 12th August, 1931. Robert Alderton to Henry Alcott. The farm and cottage sold for a price so low it could only have been desperation. A handwritten note in the same hand as the will was pinned to it. A wrong my father committed. I will not carry it into the next world. Third, a small envelope addressed in Edmund's hand to T.A. Inside was a short letter, dated only a week before the murder. My dear Thomas, yes, you were right to come. The papers are here. I have done what I should have done years ago. Come on the 20th and we shall make it official. Until then, the drawer will keep our secret. Your cousin, Edmund Howe, read the documents in silence. Then he looked up at Douglas. Douglas's face had gone the color of old ash. He changed it, he said, almost to himself. The old fool actually changed it. Cecily said nothing. She simply stared at the open drawer, her hands now empty of the bracelet, her expression perfectly still. Mrs. Pugh, standing in the doorway, made a small sound, half sigh, half condemnation, and turned away. It was Miss Marple who spoke next, very gently. I believe, Inspector, there is something else you should see. In the cupboard at the end of the passage. The one where Mrs. Pugh keeps the spare linens. I noticed it yesterday when I was passing. Howe raised an eyebrow but gave a curt nod to Reeves. The young constable returned 2 minutes later holding a length of thin picture wire, neatly coiled, one end still bearing a faint dark smear. The bruising at the throat, Howe said quietly. Matches exactly. Douglas took a step backward. "That's not mine. I've never seen it before." "No," Miss Marple said, almost kindly. "But it was in the house, and someone used it 4 nights ago, then hid it, rather hastily, I imagine." She looked at Cecily then. Not accusingly, but with the same mild interest she might have shown a difficult stitch that had finally revealed its pattern. Cecily met her gaze for a long moment, then looked away toward the window. Miss Marple turned back to Inspector Howe. Her voice remained soft, almost conversational. There is one more thing, Inspector. The person who was moving through the upstairs bedroom with a torch the night before last. I believe they were not searching for the will. They already knew where it was. They were looking for something else entirely." Howe's eyes narrowed. "And what would that be, Miss Marple?" She smiled, very faintly. "Proof," she said. "Proof of who had been in the study on the night Mr. Alderton died. Because someone came back, and they left something behind that they very much needed to recover." Outside, the mist had begun to lift at last. A pale sun touched the lawn, but the air in the study remained cold. Douglas Alderton stood very still, his hands clenched at his sides. Cecily had not moved, and Miss Marple, small and white-haired and unremarkable, folded her hands over the handle of her bag and waited, and as she had waited so many times before, for the last piece to fall quietly into place. She knew now what the night intruder had been searching for. She also knew that the final answer would not be found in the drawer. It would be found in the house itself, and in the person who had never quite left it. Miss Marple explains. The drawing room at Alderton House was not a room built for drama. It had been furnished in the last years of the old Queen's reign, with heavy velvet curtains the color of claret, a Turkey carpet worn soft at the edges, and a fireplace where the logs always seemed to burn a little too slowly. That evening, however, the room held 6 people who understood that something final was about to be said. The lamps had been lit early. Outside, the October dusk had thickened into proper dark, and the mist had returned to press its pale face against the window panes. Inspector Howe stood by the mantelpiece, hands behind his back. Douglas Alderton sat rigid in the wing chair nearest the fire, his face pale but composed. Cecily sat beside him on the small settee, her left wrist now bare. Mrs. Pugh occupied a straight-backed chair by the door, as though she might need to leave at any moment to fetch something useful. Reverend Hollis had come at Miss Marple's quiet invitation. He fidgeted with his spectacles and looked unhappy, as good men often do when evil has walked too close. And in the center of it all, small and neat in her grey wool dress, Miss Marple sat with her hands folded in her lap and her knitting bag at her feet. She had not brought the needles out. Not yet. Howe cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, you asked us all to be here. I think the time has come for plain speaking." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you, Inspector. I shall try to be as brief as the facts allow." She looked first at Douglas, then at Cecily, then at the others, her blue eyes mild and unhurried. "Mr. Edmund Alderton was a private man who discovered, late in life, that his family owed a debt. Not a debt of money, but of justice. In 1931, his father, Robert Alderton, bought the Alcott farm at Stanton for a price that was little better than robbery. The Alcotts lost everything. The boy in the photograph on the study mantelpiece, the one labeled E.R. and the boy, Stanton, 1931, was Henry Alcott's son, Thomas Alcott's father. When young Thomas came here last summer, he did not come merely as a distant cousin. He came with proof. He showed Mr. Alderton the old deeds, the letters, the truth. And Mr. Alderton, a man who had spent his life keeping things tidy, decided to set the matter right. He changed his will. He summoned his solicitor twice. He placed the new will, the old deeds, and a letter for Thomas in the locked drawer. Then he wrote to Thomas and asked him to return on the 20th of October so that everything could be made official. Miss Marple paused. The fire crackled once, sharply. Douglas knew something was happening. 8 months earlier, he had asked his uncle about the drawer and had been refused. He suspected a new will. He had already received a large sum from his uncle for a business that failed, and he could not afford to lose the rest. So he did what many desperate men do. He turned to his wife. Cecily's hands tightened in her lap, but she did not speak. Some years ago, Miss Marple continued gently, Douglas gave Cecily a bracelet. A pretty thing. One of the charms was a small gold key. It was not decorative. It was a working copy of the key to that drawer. Douglas had seen the drawer many times, as he knew its peculiarities. The left-handed turn, the slight angle. He had the key made by a jeweler in Markston and presented it to his wife as a romantic trinket. She wore it every day. It was, after all, only a charm. Douglas made a small sound, half laugh, half groan. Miss Marple went on as though she had not heard it. On the night of the 14th, Douglas came to the house late. He let himself in. He still had his own key from years of visits. He found his uncle in the study, reading. They argued about the will. Mr. Alderton would not be moved. In the heat of the moment, Douglas seized the picture wire that Mrs. Pugh kept in the linen cupboard for hanging new curtains. He strangled his uncle. Then he took the key from the drawer, the real key, not the charm, and hid it under the rug in the hallway, moving the rug only a few inches because he was in a hurry, and the hall was dark. He left the house, believing the drawer would remain locked forever and the new will undiscovered. But he had made two mistakes. The first was that he did not know Cecily had already used the charm key more than once to look inside the drawer. She had seen the new will. She knew what it contained, and she was afraid. The second mistake was the car. Walt Hobbs saw it parked by the oak tree 3 nights before the murder. Douglas had come once already, trying to persuade his uncle to change his mind. He failed. That was the night the study light burned late. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Cecily. After the murder, Cecily was terrified. She knew her husband had done it. She also knew the new will was still in the drawer. And on the night before last, she came back to the house, quietly with a torch, to find the will and destroy it. She searched the bedrooms first, thinking perhaps her husband had hidden something there that might connect him to the crime. She found nothing. The will was still in the drawer, which she could not open that night because the charm key had already been taken by Inspector Howe for examination. A long silence filled the room. Douglas spoke at last, his voice hoarse. "You have no proof? None of this is proof?" Miss Marple looked at him with something almost like pity. "The proof is in the wire, Mr. Alderton. The smear on it matches the bruise on your uncle's throat. The proof is in the rug, moved by someone in a hurry. The proof is in the keyhole, worn only on the left side because someone left-handed, like you, Douglas, used it repeatedly. And the proof is in the letter Mr. Alderton wrote to Thomas Alcott, which names the very debt you were so desperate to keep hidden. You killed your uncle to protect an inheritance built on a wrong your grandfather committed, and your wife, out of loyalty or fear or love, perhaps all three, tried to protect you afterwards." Howe moved then. He nodded once to Constable Reeves, who had been waiting silently by the door. "Douglas Alderton," the inspector said, "I am arresting you on the charge of the murder of Edmund Alderton. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." Douglas did not resist. He stood up slowly, as though the bones in his legs had grown old in the last 5 minutes. Cecily remained seated, her face white but dry-eyed. Mrs. Pugh rose and left the room without a word. The sound of her footsteps faded down the corridor like the closing of a book. Reverend Hollis murmured something about prayer and mercy. Miss Marple only folded her hands a little more tightly. Later, when the police car had driven away and the house had emptied, Miss Marple walked back down Fenwick Lane with Clara at her side. The mist had lifted again. A few stars showed between the branches of the yew trees. From the cottages came the smell of wood smoke and the faint clink of supper dishes. Clara spoke first. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled, a small, tired smile. "Not from the very beginning, dear. only from the moment I saw the drawer and understood that someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to keep it closed. After that, it was simply a matter of noticing what people wished to hide. They reached Clara's cottage gate. Miss Marple paused, one hand on the latch. "Nothing dangerous was ever supposed to happen here," she said softly, echoing the words that had begun the whole affair. "And yet it did. People are very much the same everywhere, Clara, in villages or in cities. They lock away their secrets and hope no one will find the key." She went inside. The fire was still burning low. Her knitting lay on the small table where she had left it that morning. She picked it up, settled into the armchair, and for the first time in many days the needles moved steadily, click, 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 forming row after perfect row. Outside, the village of Chippingcroft slept under the quiet October stars, as though nothing at all had happened. But in the morning, the baker's boy would cycle past Alderton House, the post would arrive, and Mrs. Hartley at number 7 would open her curtains exactly as usual. Some stories end with a scream. This one ended with the small, steady sound of knitting needles in a lamplit room and the knowledge that justice, like a difficult stitch, had at last been put right.